Salem, Massachusetts, September 19, 1692. You are watching an 81-year-old man lying on his back in an open field next to a prison. He is completely naked. A heavy wooden board covers his chest and stomach. Standing over him is the High Sheriff of Essex County. The sheriff is 26 years old. He has deputies with him, and they are carrying heavy field stones. Every few minutes, the young sheriff asks the old man a simple question. It is a legal formality. All the old man has to do is say two words, "not guilty." If he says those words, the stones stop. He will be allowed to stand up, he will be taken into a courtroom, given a rigged trial, and hanged. But the old man refuses to speak. He knows exactly how this judicial system works, and he has found the one structural flaw in the legal machinery of the British Empire that the sheriff cannot fix. The sheriff spends 2 days trying to break Giles Corey. Giles Corey needs only 2 words to break the sheriff. This is how he did it. Salem, 1692, 6 months before the execution. The Salem Witch Trials are almost always remembered as a crisis of religion, a panic, a fever of superstition that infected an isolated Puritan colony. But hysteria is just an emotion. To arrest, imprison, and execute dozens of people across a county requires logistics. It requires manpower. It requires feeding prisoners, paying guards, and maintaining chains. Above all, it requires funding. Beneath the religious terror, Salem was operating as a highly efficient engine of wealth transfer. At the center of that engine was a 26-year-old man named George Corwin. George Corwin was the High Sheriff of Essex County. He was the nephew of one of the presiding magistrates. He was young, hyper-ambitious, and legally untouchable. When a citizen of Salem was accused of witchcraft, Sheriff Corwin was the official dispatched to arrest him. But Corwin rarely just took the prisoner, he took their assets. By English common law, the property of a convicted witch was forfeit to the crown. The local officials managed the confiscation and liquidation of those estates. Corwin, however, did not wait for the convictions. The moment a warrant was issued, his men would descend on the accused farm. They took cattle, they took grain, they took farming tools, furniture, and family heirlooms. They carted the generational wealth of Salem citizens away, legally shielded by the panic of the community. For months, this system operated flawlessly. Accusation, arrest, confiscation, trial, execution. Corwin built a highly profitable machine, running on the fear of the public and the absolute authority of the court, until his machine targeted a farmer named Giles Corey. Giles Corey was not a typical Salem victim. He was not young, he was 81 years old. He was not quiet, and he was not particularly well liked by his neighbors. He was a wealthy, fiercely stubborn man who had spent his entire adult life fighting the people around him over property lines, boundaries, and debts. He owned over 100 acres of prime farming land in Salem Village. Corey had watched the trials unfold. He had watched Sheriff Corwin's men strip neighboring farms bare, leaving families destitute while the accused waited in the dungeons. In April 1992, the hysteria reached his own threshold. His wife, Martha, was accused, arrested, and eventually sentenced to hang. 5 months later, the court came for him. On September 18th, Giles Corey was formally indicted on charges of witchcraft. Sheriff Corwin understood the economics of the situation immediately. 100 acres of prime land, livestock, decades of accumulated assets. It was a massive prize for the confiscation machine. But Corwin deeply underestimated his target. Giles had spent decades navigating the courts, suing and being sued. He understood the mechanics of colonial law better than most of the magistrates sitting on the bench, and he understood the one procedural luck that Corwin could not pick. The English legal system in 1692 operated on a strict, unbreakable set of procedural rules. Before any trial could begin, the prisoner had to be brought before the judge and asked how they plead, guilty or not guilty. This was known as putting oneself on the country. It was the mandatory trigger that started the trial process. Without a trial, there could be no conviction. Without a conviction, the state had no legal right to permanently seize a man's estate. If a man died before he was convicted, his land would automatically pass to his legal heirs. Corey saw the exploit. If he pled not guilty, he would be tried by a rigged court, found guilty, hanged, and Corwin would take the 100 acres. If he pled guilty, the trial would be skipped, he would hang, and Corwin would take the 100 acres. The only way to win was to refuse to play the game entirely. When Giles Corey was brought before the court to enter his plea, he stood perfectly still, he kept his mouth shut. The judges ordered him to speak. He looked at them and said nothing. This was known in English law as standing mute. It was a catastrophic problem for the magistrates. They could not legally proceed with the hearing. The gears of the judicial machine completely jammed in front of the entire town. But the law had a contingency for this exact scenario, a medieval statute designed centuries earlier in England to deal with uncooperative prisoners. It was called peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, pressing. It had never been used in the history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but Sheriff Corwin needed the 100 acres, and the court needed to maintain the illusion of its absolute authority. He ordered the young sheriff to take the 81-year-old man into a field, lay him on the ground, and crush him until he spoke. Salem, September 18, 1692, the first day. The procedure of pressing was strictly regulated by dark tradition. It was not intended to be a quick death. It was engineered to maximize physical suffering over an extended time frame, slowly increasing the physiological terror until the psychological will of the prisoner snapped. Corwin's men strip Corey of his clothing and lay him flat on the cold ground. They place a heavy wooden board across his torso, extending from his chest down to his stomach. The sheriff approaches. He looks down at the old man and asks him to enter a plea to the court. Corey stares up at the sky and says nothing. Corwin gives the signal. The deputies bring the first stones. They are heavy field stones, the kind used to build the foundational walls of Salem. They place them carefully on the center of the board. The physics of pressing are clinical and brutal. With the first 50 pounds, the body simply registers pressure. The chest muscles have to work slightly harder to expand the lungs. With 100 pounds, breathing becomes a conscious, exhausting effort. The rib cage struggles to rise against the gravity of the rocks. The diaphragm is forced downward against severe resistance. Corwin waits. He understands exactly what he is doing. He is not trying to kill Giles Corey. A dead man cannot enter a plea. He needs Corey alive, in agony, willing to say two simple words to make the crushing weight stop. He asks for the plea again. Corey remains silent. More stones are added. With 200 pounds, the biology of the human body begins to actively fail. The intercostal muscles fatigue and begin to cramp. Carbon dioxide starts to build up in the bloodstream. The panic response of suffocation sets in, a hardwired biological alarm in the brain screaming at the body to take a deep breath it simply cannot manage to take. Corwin leans down. He explains the reality of the situation to the old man. The stones will not stop. The pain will not end. The court has all the time in the world. Just say the words. Corey turns his head, looks at the young sheriff, and finally speaks. He does not plead. He does not beg for mercy. He says two words: more weight. Corwin stares at him. Then he orders his men to bring heavier stones. September 19th, the second day. Giles Corey has survived the night under the board. The temperature in September, Massachusetts drops sharply after dark. He is laid naked on the cold earth, crushed beneath hundreds of pounds of rock, unable to sleep, unable to move, taking shallow, ragged sips of air. He is 81 years old. His body is enduring catastrophic internal damage. The massive pressure is restricting blood flow to his vital organs. His ribs are bowing violently inward, threatening to fracture and puncture his lungs with every millimeter of compression. The town has gathered to watch. This is no longer a secret interrogation hidden in a dungeon. It is a public spectacle in broad daylight. Corwin is becoming desperate. The optics of the situation are turning against him rapidly. The Salem Witch Trials ran entirely on the illusion of righteousness. The court was supposed to be doing the divine work of God, protecting the village from the influence of the devil. But there's nothing righteous about watching a 26-year-old local official slowly crush an 81-year-old man to death in a dirt field over a property dispute. The crowd is murmuring. The fear that kept the town compliant for 6 months is shifting into deep disgust. Corwin needs this to end. He needs the plea. If Corey dies without speaking, the state loses the land. But far more importantly, the state looks incredibly weak. The system looks broken. Corwin orders more weight. The men stack the heaviest stones they can find. The total weight is now immense. The pressure on Corey's chest is so extreme that it forces his tongue to protrude out of his mouth. In a moment of pure, grotesque cruelty, Sheriff Corwin takes his wooden walking stick and pushes the old man's tongue back behind his teeth. He asks for the plea one last time. Corey does not have the breath for a speech. He does not have the breath for a grand historical curse. He uses the absolute last reserve of oxygen inside his collapsing lungs to deliver his final verdict on Sheriff Corwin, the court, and the entire rigged system of Salem. More weight. The rib cage finally gives way. The lungs collapse under the trauma. On September 19, 1692, after 2 agonizing days of torture, Giles Corey dies. He never entered a plea. He never recognized the authority of the court, and he never surrendered his land. Sheriff Corwin stares at the dead man under the stones. He has won the physical battle. He has lost everything else. Because Giles Corey died without a criminal conviction, his estate remained legally his property. Before his arrest, Corey had quietly written a will, transferring the 100 acres and all his assets to his 2 son-in-laws. The deed holds up in the colonial courts. Corwin, it's absolutely nothing. But the damage to the system is far more severe than a single lost farm. Giles Corey did not just protect his wealth, he broke the psychological spell of Salem. The public execution by pressing horrifies the Massachusetts colony. It shatters the carefully constructed narrative of a holy court. For the first time, the citizens of Salem see the judicial machine not as their divine protector, but as a ravenous mechanical monster. The tide turns almost instantly. Just 3 days after Corey's death, the court hangs the last group of accused citizens, a group that includes Corey's wife. It is the last time anyone will ever be executed for witchcraft in Salem. 1 month later, the governor of Massachusetts steps in and dissolves the court entirely. The trials are definitively over. The confiscation machine is shut down. The system collapses completely. But the story of George Corwin is not finished. With the court dissolved, Corwin loses his absolute authority. He is no longer the untouchable enforcer of the law. He is just a young man who stole from his neighbors. The families of the victims begin to file lawsuits. They sue Corwin for the illegal seizure of their property. They sue him for the cattle, the grain, the heirlooms, and the land. The legal protection that shielded him evaporates. He is tied up in colonial courts, financially drained, his reputation destroyed, openly despised by the very town he used to terrorize. 4 years pass. Corwin is 30 years old. He's young. He should have decades of life and career ahead of him. In 1696, George Corwin's heart suddenly fails. He drops dead. The man who spent his 20s tearing apart families and seizing their lands is dead at 30. But the severe irony of Corwin's death does not end there. When he dies, his family prepares to bury him in the local Salem cemetery. But the citizens of Salem remember exactly what he did. The creditors and the families of his victims declare openly that they will seize Corwin's corpse. They intend to hold his dead body hostage until his remaining financial debts are paid and their stolen property is fully compensated. His family is terrified. They know the town will rip his body to pieces. In the dark of night, the family makes a desperate decision. They cannot risk taking the High Sheriff of Essex County outside. They dig a deep hole in the dirt floor of his own basement. They lower his coffin into the ground beneath his house and bury him in the dark.
History records the facts. Giles Corey died at 81, crushed in an open field, stripped of its clothes but holding on to the one thing that mattered. George Corwin died at 30, stripped of his power, hiding his own corpse from the town he tried to break. The young sheriff thought he was building a flawless system that would make him rich. Giles Corey needed 2 words and 2 days to ensure the sheriff dug his own grave.